Hello, welcome back to Saturn Sirens. We have a really exciting thing happening right now. We have Angie from Yumi and the Stars. She's on TikTok. She has really great information on there, so check her out. But today, I think we're going to be talking about retrograde planets. Mary, take it away.
Hi guys, let's talk about retrograde planets. We currently have 6 planets in retrograde as we speak, as we record this, 7 if you count Chiron. When planets go retrograde, it's kind of a time to slow down and retrospect. The energy gets turned inwards, and it's kind of a time to reevaluate whatever we've been working on. Obviously, depending on the nature of the planet, it's all different based on which planet is in retrograde. The power of the planet kind of diminishes. You're encouraged to slow down, reflect, and redefine your path forward. Sometimes when planets go retrograde, inconsistencies and bad habits are brought to our attention. So we're really being shown what we need to improve, or the areas of life that we need to work on based on that planet. So I want to talk a little bit about Mercury retrograde. Although it's direct now, I have it in my birth chart retrograde, so does Angie. So I think this is a great place to start. So what's it like having Mercury retrograde in the birth chart? You're pretty used to people misunderstanding you, and no matter how hard you try to communicate, it kind of comes across wrong. It's almost like having Mercury in the 12th house, where the energy of Mercury is turned inwards. We also can be overthinkers and introspective, and we're not even aware that we come across that way most of the time. It's funny because, Angie and I are both share a Mercury retrograde placement, so I'm curious to know your take on it, Angie.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I would also add that, especially with Mercury retrograde, as much as it has a challenging points to it, the dyslexia, transposing numbers and letters, your directional sign. I'm notorious for hitting my left turn signal while I'm turning right. It's really annoying. There's also kind of an upside to it, because as much as there's the diminished part of the Mercury retrograde, the thing that I wouldn't trade that comes with it is that unique perspective, the unique way of perceiving things that people just can't take a class and learn. You either have it or you don't. So with all those things of feeling not understood and feeling like people don't care what you had to say, or they're never going to understand what you're thinking, it's kind of awesome to have this unique way of perceiving things versus the rest of the world. Mercury retrograde's like less than 20% of the charts out there of all the people. So that means that's a unique perspective to like 80% of the world. That's pretty cool.
That's awesome. I actually didn't even know that 20% of people are born with it, but it makes sense given Mercury going retrograde 4 times a year. So what planets do you have in retrograde in your chart, Jason Pierre?
I have none.
Literally none?
None.
Well, lucky you.
Wow.
You're like my son.
But I have a 12 house stellium. So.
Well, that's actually good. My son was born during that short period of time in 2022. It was like a 2-month period where all the planets were direct. That was, totally a coincidence. So he has no retrograde planets. What about you, Pierre?
I have Pluto and Uranus and Black Moon Lilith.
Yeah, I have some asteroids.
Let's talk about Uranus retrograde, actually, and I want to kind of get your take on this, Pierre. I don't have it in retrograde, but the way I've seen it manifest is when Uranus is kind of how you rebel, how you go your own way. So it's your individuality, and it's also the ruler of Aquarius, Saturn as well. I consider this the secondary ruler. So when it's in retrograde, usually they go through their life abiding by the rules in that very Saturnian type of way where they do things based off of, they play it safe. It comes to a point where the energy of Uranus, because it was suppressed or kind of turned inwards, they reach a point in their life where they just completely rebel. And a lot of people think it's like a midlife crisis, but it comes from suppressing that energy unconsciously because they're born with Uranus retrograde. So I'm curious to know if that happened with you.
I sort of see my Uranus more related to how I communicate and how I think, because it is in my 3rd house. I would just say that I always interpret things opposite of how they are or differently. I have this one example. You know that street sign where you're about to go over a bridge and it says bridge freezes before road or something like that? And I swear that always stops me because I'm like, I get this picture and I'm like, what do you mean? Like literally I'm driving down the road and I'm like, What do you mean the bridge freezes before the road? The bridge is after the road. Like, this is all going on in my head. That's like me with so many things, or I'll always figure out some different way to do something. And sometimes I have to correct things because I do just kind of go way out there on how I interpret or how I say something. Or a lot of times, like, I'll have the same thing that you're saying. People might not understand what I'm saying because I don't know, maybe I can't articulate it. It's very clear in my mind. And then later, people will be like, oh, now I understand what you were trying to say.
I feel like with Neptune retrograde, it makes you kind of stoic. With Neptune retrograde, the energy of like compassion is turned inwards. So it's not that you're not compassionate, you very much are, but you kind of don't really want people to see it. It's more so you hide it. It can make you kind of stoic when you have Neptune retrograde or you come off that way. Pluto retrograde, I feel like they are dealing with these issues of power and control and the abuse of authority and all of that Pluto related stuff throughout their life. And they're really also meant to own their own power. You could be born with a planet direct, but it can turn retrograde in your progress chart.
My Mars in my progress chart is in Leo and it's retrograde.
My Pluto turned retrograde and my progressed as well. So I don't know what that even means, to be honest.
I think now my Jupiter and probably my Neptune are retrograde by progression. And I know my Mercury will go when I'm in my 80s. What I've learned is that a lot of what you'll see is that when the progressed planet stations is a lot where you might experience some sort of turning point in life related to the significations around that planet and maybe the area that it rules or the house that it's in. You know, it's just kind of like when we have transiting retrogrades, it's kind of like slamming on the brakes. And so you might have some adjustment time. And then you very well might go back over the things that that planet passed over beforehand. But I mean, obviously, if it's an outer planet, it's not going to move that much. And another thing that I've been taught is that let's say you do have a planet, let's say it was direct and then it retrogrades in your secondary progress chart and then it hits your natal point. That apparently will be also an intensification point or turning point around the issues with that planet when it conjuncts itself by progression.
I have one of the more not heard of progressions. My Pluto retrograde is actually progressed direct. That's not super common. And when it progressed direct, I literally went through like an actual awakening. My two kids were almost killed in a car accident. I quit my 20-year career of doing hair and announced to the world, hey, I'm into astrology, kind of always have been. That's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to move across the country. And everybody was kind of like, what? What's happening? And it was that true like Pluto walking through this fire, but feeling that sense of empowerment, finally feeling like I wasn't at the mercy of things happening to me and starting to realize, wait a second, I can be the one who decides how this goes. And literally when that whole thing shifted. And I learned about progressions a year after that. But with Neptune retrograde is one of those things that I feel like just does not get enough credit for the psychic abilities that come with it, especially if somebody has it really prominent. And I'm not just saying this because I have it in the first house. Neptune retrograde, it heightens your sensitivity to drugs. I know that, especially things that make you feel loopy. I've always been extra sensitive to things like Benadryl, just anything that can make you feel woozy or loopy. And at the same time, I've always either smoked or vaped or done something to dull my astral plane because I'm so sensitive all the time, taking it all in. And I didn't realize that smoking was part of those unconscious behaviors that we do to dull that. So it isn't such an exposed nerve to the world all the time. It also, I think, comes with a certain projection field of its own where people kind of project certain things, Neptunian, almost like not celebrity, but where we put somebody on some kind of pedestal in our mind, but they're not really that person. I feel like I get that projection from other people a lot when I'm always like, nope, I'm flawed. I'm really, really flawed. I am not perfect at all. But there are people who tend to look at me like I have the answers to salvation. And I'm always looking at that Neptune retrograde, like, what did you do? Why did you make it look like I know what I'm doing?
That's so funny because I kind of feel that way about you. I'm I'm like,
That's why
oh.
I'm like, no, I'm telling you. I'm all kinds of weird.
People project their ideal onto you for sure when you have
Yeah.
Neptune, even just Neptune in the first house. It's like
Yeah.
people definitely, and they just don't see you clearly. It can feel like a lot to live up to for sure because that's Neptune. It's like illusion. I feel that way as well. So I totally get what you're saying. You just come off like so ethereal to me. I'm like, it's the Neptune energy, but I also have Pisces North Node, 7th house. So I just love Neptune energy in general. So let's talk about personal planets when they are retrograde. We talked about Mercury a little bit, but what about Venus and Mars? Because they go retrograde much less.
I feel like those are the hardest ones. I really do. I feel like those two out of all of them are the ones that pack the most personal everyday punch just because they affect us on our relationships on such a core level of just
My
expressing.
boyfriend has Mars retrograde.
And didn't you say your Mars has progressed retrograde too as well?
Yeah.
Coincidence? I think not.
Wow. I never put that together.
I was dating someone and I was like, what is wrong with this person? Like, why can't you just express love like a normal person? And sure enough, his Venus went retrograde in his progressed chart. I also feel like a lot of their partners or their relationships, they knew them in past lives when Venus is in retrograde. Usually when I see this, there's at least one divorce in their life. Relationships are also pretty painful for them. And they're known to really love you like from a distance. Like they could love you so intensely and not be able to express it. So they'll just be in love with you forever and you won't even know. That can be very Venus retrograde, especially if it's in a sign like Scorpio. When I see it in a chart, if it's a man, I feel like that this brings issues with women that are very karmic. So usually there are many issues throughout his life between him and the opposite sex. And it can even bring financial issues because Venus rules money. When I see it in a woman's chart, she also can have issues with women, but mostly issues expressing her femininity and all of that Venusian energy that we relate to so much as women. It can feel stifled or blocked. I also see in synastry quite often, which is pretty trippy, men who have Mars in retrograde marrying women who have Venus in retrograde, or vice versa, which is, pretty unusual, but I feel like what are the odds? But kind of makes sense. Those two planets in specific are hard. I think they're harder than Mercury retrograde, Angie.
I agree. And I've also noticed that Mars and Venus, especially, but Mercury too, Mars and Venus really seem to be those things you see played out in families, like generation after generation after generation. My stepdaughter has Mars retrograde. So does my brother-in-law, her uncle. And Mars retrograde is like 7, 8, 9% of the population. So again, what are the odds? It's not a coincidence. It seems to be this karmic pattern that families have passed down. And Mars retrograde, one of my favorite astrologers talks about retrogrades. Her name's Lynn Coiner. She gave this awesome analogy of with Mars retrograde bottling up that anger and frustration like a beach ball that you push underwater. And at some point, the beach ball has to pop up. And when it does, it kind of shocks everybody, including the person who's like, all of a sudden, the volcano is erupting. And they're like, oh my God, I didn't mean to erupt. And they're trying to like pull the words back into their mouth. And then they go back to like stuffing it all back down again. And this seems to like stem from families who have an idea that generations back, something happened that made the people or person that this started with in the family feel like they couldn't stick up for themselves. Like they didn't have a voice. Or if they did say something, they were going to be retaliated or they were going to like physically be hurt. So there's this fear of speaking up. So they just don't. And then that gets all like wound up. And then all of a sudden it's like, and then they go back to pulling it all back in again.
The retrograde planet is actually very strong. It's kind of like an excess of whatever the significations are for that planet. It's almost like a waste of that energy because there's an excess and the person doesn't know what to do with it. That's why you end up going back. It can be a key to your success in this life, but you have to figure out what to do with it because a lot of times the things don't turn out the way they should because it's just so much. It's just like anything when you're overly eager. And then the other thing, like what Angie said, that karmic piece, it really is about coming back to finish what you didn't finish before, like in a previous life. There's something that you really came here to focus on, and it's really pinpointed inside of you because there's so much that you don't know what to do with. So you're like holding on to it. How do I manage this? Because you are working with it so much, going back and forth, that's when you perfect it. And that's why you see people who are new to astrology are like, oh, Mercury retrograde is not, you don't have all of the good significations, but that's not true. You'll find like a lot of people who are brilliant with those retrograde planets because they do have to work with that energy a lot more.
Yeah,
love what
that's
you
so
said.
true. Especially people who have Mars retrograde, people describe them as, well, they never get angry. It seems that way until they explode out of nowhere one day because they've been bottling it up for so
Right.
long. Kind of like having a Mars in detriment, but I think even more exaggerated with that. Because even me with Mars in Taurus, even in a Cancer degree, which is another sign of Mars's detriment, where Mars falls. So I very much have a hard time expressing anger. So it bottles up and then I just erupt, and it can also cause health issues. So they really come back here to kind of go for what they want and redo what they missed out on in a past life. They didn't go for what they want, basically. With Mars retrograde, they didn't stand up for themselves. A lot of times, like Angie said, it's a generational thing. It's kind of like started somewhere back in their lineage. They're being given that chance again to go for what they want. And I think that's why what Pierce said makes so much sense, because it's like that energy is almost stronger because it's like bottling up and bottling up. It's like putting a lid on something that's filling up with water, and it just got to go somewhere eventually. So that's supposed to kind of like force them to take action finally, or at least, hopefully. Venus retrograde too, a lot of them suffer from the one that got away, and they'll go back to like their high school sweetheart like 20 years later after they both married different people and had kids and all of that. But they'll still be thinking of that one person that never worked with, and they'll like go back to that person. That's very common. I see that a lot with Venus retrograde. I think those are the hardest two planets to have in retrograde, because even when they go retrograde in the sky, like throughout our life, we feel that energy as well. Like when Mars went retrograde in Gemini for so long, seemingly forever, it literally felt like time stopped and Mars is going to be retrograde forever. And then it finally went direct and then into Cancer. It was tough that time, at least for me. I think we all definitely feel the retrograde planets, the personal planets, the most, with the exception of Mercury, because it goes retrograde so much. I actually find that I thrive during Mercury retrograde, but that's probably because of my natal Mercury retrograde. I don't know about you, Angie, or if you experience the typical stuff with Mercury retrograde.
Well, yeah, I think it's just more of, it's kind of just the status quo because you're so used to your life kind of being a Mercury retrograde movie that it just doesn't seem like the disruption that it is to everybody else, because you have that disruption all the time. What I do think is interesting, I really like what Pierce said about the energy not being, I don't like the word diminished when we're talking about retrograde stuff, because that does kind of make it sound like the energy is dialed back, and it's not. It's actually cranked way, way up, but it's got like this lid on it. If you guys work with interceptions, intercepted planets very much operate like a retrograde planet, and so do south node planets. So if you've got a planet on your south node, it will kind of operate like a retrograde planet, because the whole point is to get the energy, to get you to be able to express the energy of that planet appropriately. Appropriately is always the word that comes to mind, because like Mars retrograde, it's kind of fitting that here we have the real resident expert on Mars retrograde, the one person who's sitting here with progressed Mars retrograde and a partner with it, and she's doing her Mars retrograde thing where she is being a wallflower back here and not taking initiative. So what's this like been for you?
I heard that men have more stamina in the bedroom.
Yeah, it's true.
So can you tell us about that? Can you vouch for that? Yes or no? Just say yes or no.
Interestingly, Chase, your progressed Mars is now in Leo.
My natal is in Virgo.
That's another point as well, when your progressed planet crosses into a new sign. So your Mars, you were actually born where it's stationed, May of 2000. And then, so May 2000, and then that's like a slow Mars. May, June 2020, it went into Leo.
I didn't really think about my progressed Mars being retrograde a lot, but now that I think about it, I kind of thought this was because I have Mars opposing Saturn.
Sure, that too.
I don't get angry easily. It takes me so much to get angry, and I'm very, very, very patient. But then once I'm angry, like, I'm going to take it to the grave.
Are you dramatically angry now that Mars is in Mars?
I'm
progressed
cranky.
Mars is in
I'm
Leo.
literally so cranky. Oh, ever since I've been cranky for like 2 weeks since Mars went into Scorpio.
Well, that's also Scorpio stellium.
Well,
Yeah.
that's your 12th house. So the 12th house Mars would be similar to like what we've been saying, I think, about retrograde Mars.
Who wants to talk about Saturn retrograde?
I do. I feel like this one has a lot of layers because there's so many like childhood significations there too. Because if you have Saturn retrograde, childhood, your experience with dad, there was either something missing in the relationship, or he was either gone for chunks at a time in your life, or chunks of the day, or something happened where your idea of what was your problem and what isn't became a very distorted thing. So these people are people who grow up with a very strong issue with boundaries. They don't know when to say, no, that's enough. That becomes a really big question mark. And the way that I see Saturn retrograde play out in relationships is these are people who they have two speeds. They're either the doormat that's like, oh, no, that's okay. No problem. No problem. I have no boundaries. You can just do whatever. Or it's the other way where they build such a wall of boundaries so they don't get hurt that they actually keep people out. It becomes this thing where they usually want intimacy, but there's a fear and some kind of wall that seems to be in their way.
Kind of like 8th house Saturn, I feel like it can be like this fear of being vulnerable. I also think sometimes the dad just wasn't physically present. Other times it was emotionally, like you were saying. They're learning lessons about taking responsibility, and a lot of that has to do with boundaries too. They can also kind of be more disorganized, not really coloring within the lines. So they could be a little bit more rebellious or even like defiant of authority in general. But for the most part, having natal Saturn retrograde pretty much always something was going on there with the dad, like you were saying. He just wasn't present, or there was a disconnect, sometimes emotionally, or he had to work a lot, whatever it was. But I found this to be always true when I see Saturn retrograde in the birth chart. And I actually learned that from you, Angie. I think you made a video about it where you talked about Saturn retrograde.
Yeah.
I know when Saturn moves retrograde, like in the sky through transit, it's when karma gets served. I experience it, and I'm pretty sure everyone else experiences it. It's kind of when we're forced to own up to whatever mistakes we've been making or whatever it is. So like, let's say you've been overeating. When Saturn goes retrograde, that's usually when you see the weight gain. So you just kind of get slapped in the face with reality. I can't wait for it to go direct on November 4th.
This Saturn retrograde for me loosened up. I was able to get things that I've been waiting on finalized. A lot of things that I feel more productive during a Saturn retrograde.
I feel like when Saturn is transit retrograde, that's when the blockage, the thing that keeps us from doing the thing, is just our own voice, our own self-limiting thing. Whereas when Saturn's direct, it tends to be somebody else or an external thing. We are the self-deprecating voice during Saturn retrograde. For some reason, sometimes we're telling ourselves we suck on some level, when in reality, we don't. It's just that Saturn annoying voice.
Another thing that I learned, the retrograding natal planet changes the state of an exalted or debilitated planet. So if you have Saturn in Libra, if it's retrograde, it will act like Saturn in Aries. It's not going to change house, but it'll behave like a Saturn in Aries, even though it's exalted. Or if you have another debilitated planet, the same goes for a planet in detriment. So like if it was Saturn in Aries, but it's retrograde, then it may act more like an exalted Saturn in Libra. Although I will say that maybe there's something else I'm missing about some exalted planets, because some exalted planets are not like, oh, they're so great. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see that too. Like with Saturn and Libra, you would think they'd have this lifelong partner that's like true love or whatnot, because Libra rules relationships. A lot of times they just don't. Like it did not go that way at all. It's not exalting.
It's not exalting.
Well, I mean, it's still a malefic kind of related to that, which may be obvious, is that the retrograde planet and how it's behaving where it is also going to affect whatever house it rules as well.
Yeah, so I think we covered them all the retrograde planets. If you have any retrograde planets in your birth chart, I think that you'll find this helpful. With all the retrogrades going on right now, it's perfectly normal to feel like you just want to slow down and not really take action as much because you're literally going against the energy of the universe. There are times to turn inwards when planets are in retrograde, and we've got a bunch of them going retrograde right now. Stay tuned for next time. What are we going to talk about, guys?
I don't know yet. We're going to have to make it up as we go.
We'll see. We don't know. We'll surprise you.
We'll surprise
like
ourselves
Saturn
as well.
So we'll leave it open
Thanks for
to suggestion then.
Yeah, suggest what we should do. We're going to go record our weekly forecast. So see you guys there.
Bye.
Bye.